Susan, do you want to start? Thank you. All right. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. This is the last event of our 2021 Building Our City speaker series. My name is Chris Joyelle. I'm the director of Mountain True's Healthy Communities Program and the Asheville Design Center. Together with my colleague, Susan Bean, and Thrive Asheville's Kate Pett, we are the organizers of this year's series. I want to start by saying that the Building Our City speaker series wouldn't be possible without the generous support and advice of our sponsors. Our sustaining sponsor is Mosaic Community Lifestyle Realty. Our contributing sponsors are Urban 3 and the City of Asheville. I'd like to thank many of you as well who have made a recent donation in support of this series. So today for our format, our speaker, Jason Harden, will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and then we'll field questions from the audience. I'll encourage you to type your questions into the Q&A panel, which you should be able to find by scrolling your mouse to the bottom of the screen and clicking on the Q&A icon. I'll field the questions as they come and present them to Jason after his presentation as time allows. We intend to wrap this up by about 1 o'clock today. Also, we'll be recording the webinar, and I'll follow up with you to let you know where you can find the video in the future. All right, to our speaker. Jason Harden is a senior planner with the City of Raleigh's Planning and Development Department. His work includes area planning, rezoning, code changes, and planning studies. He recently has been involved in projects including planning for sustainability and equity around transit, measuring the carbon impacts of planning decisions, and addressing parking requirements and zoning barriers to housing choice and affordability. I first learned about Jason's work when Meg Jameson reached out to me to make an introduction. Meg directs the Southeast Sustainability Directors Network and is a friend and a longtime contributor to the Asheville Design Center. She encouraged me to reach out to Jason and learn more about his work around carbon analysis of zoning and development decisions. As part of their effort to meet carbon emission goals, the City of Raleigh has begun explicitly considering carbon emissions in all their planning decisions, whether that be rezonings, area plans, code changes, and more. The city's new carbon emissions analysis responds both to the city's goal for significantly reducing carbon emissions by 2050 and to specific policy embedded in the comprehensive plan. And so here to tell us more about that today is Jason Harden. Please join me in welcoming him to Asheville virtually. Hi, Jason, how are you?
Thanks, Chris. I'm doing great. It's great to be here with everybody. I really appreciate the invitation to talk about a topic that is really important to me, and I'm sure to most of you, all of you on this call. And I especially feel gratitude for being able to speak with people in a city that's really a great model for North Carolina and beyond. Asheville's a beautiful place, and a lot of similarities to Raleigh, in that we're looking at many of the same kinds of challenges when it comes to how we grow, population growth, decisions we make about land use and transportation. And that really goes to the core of what I'll be talking about today. So first, good to be here remotely, but do let me know if there's any issues with volume or slides or anything else. But I'm going to go ahead and jump into it and share my screen and bring up a presentation. But first, I'll talk a little bit about what motivated us in the city of Raleigh to look more deeply into this issue. And it really has to do with the fact that I frankly became very frustrated that we weren't talking about this issue more. And anybody involved in planning, whether it's on the private side, as a citizen, as a builder, on the public side, as a decision maker, as a planner, we all know there's a ton of analysis and a ton of discussion about all sorts of things when it comes to decision making in this space. And so as a staff planner with the City of Raleigh, we still produce voluminous staff reports that cover all these different aspects of, let's say, a rezoning decision or an area planning decision, looking at utilities, how much water or wastewater, certainly a heavy focus on traffic, projected trips, level of service. And then, you'll hear in the neighborhood discussions a lot about the height or of course, you get into conversations about character. But what increasingly struck me is that there was this huge topic just being almost completely and usually literally completely left out of the discussion at all, which was carbon emissions and the fact that these are the decisions that affect that we at a local level are making these decisions every day with almost literally zero thought about how it affects climate change and carbon emissions. And so I found that to be really frustrating. And we started to take a closer look at how we could put that into the conversation. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, the rationale and the thought process, how we did it just on a very nuts and bolts way, what that looked like, and some takeaways that we've had from having started this conversation. So to state the obvious, I think certainly to everybody on this call, it's an emergency. And the thing about this issue, and this is why I really found it frustrating, is this is a pretty broadly shared observation. I don't think, at least in places like Raleigh and Asheville, you do not have a lot of people who are saying, well, I don't quote unquote believe in climate change, or, there's nothing we can do about it. There's huge levels of interest in it. And I think across the board, with very few exceptions, people would say this is one of the top issues that they would like to deal with. And that led to the observation that there's a huge disconnect, though, between thinking that this is important and actually how we go about addressing it. For instance, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that meme about the 100 largest corporations produce a very large percentage of carbon emissions. And I think the underlying suggestion is that they're just doing it for some malicious reason, and all we have to do is tell them to stop and just muster up the political will and problem solve, when in reality they're supplying the products that our lifestyles are demanding. And that big disconnect is what we wanted to close the loop on in this discussion. So in addition to the fact that there's not necessarily a clear understanding of how these local decisions shape carbon emissions, there's this idea, and I think it's led to a lot of frustration, maybe changing a little bit in the last couple of months. But that climate change is only something that can be addressed in Washington, at an international summit. And I think there's been understandably a lot of frustration over the last several years with the lack of any clearly meaningful federal action on that. But again, that's in a lot of ways really similar to that idea that it's just the corporations who, I guess the idea is they're creating like a carbon Death Star out in the atmosphere, as opposed to supplying the products that we use every day. What does it look like? If we did say, well, let's make it so that these 100 corporations aren't producing so much carbon emissions, it looks like changes to our land use. It looks like changes to our transportation network and how we think about land use near transportation. These are, in other words, these are all decisions that are made locally all the time. This is actually how it happens. Whether it's a carbon tax, whether it's some more direct way of regulating carbon, that all is going to ultimately end up being implemented in our lifestyles. And a huge part of that is land use policy. It just is. And so that is an issue, for better or for worse, that we handle in this country on a very local scale. So in other words, it has to be, not only can it be addressed locally, but it has to be for this to be effective. But I think actually the biggest point of this that resonates with people is that it can be. That's been more than anything else, I think the most important thing about injecting this into our discussion with local neighborhoods here in Raleigh is that there is a way for you to make a difference on this issue. You thought that, there was nothing you could do. Maybe you could, as a sign of personal virtue, cut down on your own carbon footprint, which is great. Or you thought you could write your legislature. Actually, there's a lot more that you can do by getting involved in or altering the way, I think for a lot of people, they get involved with these decisions about land use. It's one thing to object to, let's say, an apartment building in a walkable place or near transit when your motivations are, well, I think it would change the character, the things that people say. But if you believe in climate, if you care about climate change, then and you're acting in good faith, then you have to recognize that that is a means of addressing climate change. And so that is the biggest connection and I think it empowers people, actually. I think people have been excited to see, oh, there are things that we can do, that we can tell our council we would like to see done that would make a meaningful impact on this. And I've seen it resonate with people. So just to go through a couple of slides, probably most of you are familiar with a lot of this, but why is it something that local land use decisions are so important in addressing? Well, where do emissions come from in the first place? So obviously agriculture, pretty big chunk of it, something that will need to be addressed to solve this issue. Industry, and some of that relates to this as well, but you get much more directly into this when you look at the transportation category, which is huge, and electricity as well, and land use, and we'll talk about that in a second. That shapes electricity demand, and that's been a lot of what we talk about in the city of Raleigh, and something I think, again, has been missed in a lot of the conversations. So with respect to transportation specifically, and we've tried to create a pretty simple way of talking about this, basically a way that I think reflects kind of common sense or commonly held ideas, but it just makes them a little bit clearer, some metrics attached to them. But looking at carbon emissions per passenger mile, obviously, when you get to airplanes, they burn a lot of carbon. Larger trucks, it starts to get less and less as you get to, say, a scooter or a moped, passengers on a bus, passengers on electrified transit, and you get close to zero. I would actually quibble with zero for a bicycle or walking, because it takes something to power us as we move along that way. But obviously a pretty small footprint compared to me also traveling along with a 4,000 exoskeleton, 4,000 pound piece of metal everywhere I go. That's going to take a lot more carbon to move me around. And again, so this is something that's kind of obvious. But I think what's less obvious is connecting this to land use, although it doesn't take a lot of talking through it to start to make that point. And people really do seem to get it. So another thing I don't think is widely recognized is how different our emissions are from other countries and similar countries in terms of industrialized countries that have similar economies. There's vast differences. Now, these photos up here are obviously kind of generalized. You can find lots of examples, but of different types of places in these countries, but I actually think they're fairly representative. I think what you're seeing there for the United States is a pretty representative slice of what our land use looks like. In most of our cities, for instance, much more than half of the land is dedicated only to very low density, usually single family only zoning. And it creates an environment where people have to drive everywhere. So going back to that previous slide, you're kind of automatically, by creating land use decisions like that, shifting people to those more carbon intensive ways of getting around. Looking at Ireland, obviously Ireland has super low density places too, and higher density, but again, a little bit more typical building form there. and also translates into a lot less, half as much per capita carbon emissions in Ireland. And Switzerland, again, half again, roughly as much. And you can see it in the picture if you've ever been to countries that look like these. I mean, there's a lot more density. It's much, much easier to get around in ways other than a car, and sometimes desirable to get around other than in a personal vehicle. So basically, to summarize it, and I think people generally understand this when you talk about it, heads will nod, but places like those on the top make a lot less carbon per person, because you'll get that one person who says, well, if you build a new apartment building there, isn't that more carbon emissions than that one detached house? Well, yeah, but if you don't look at it per capita, then you're kind of not really addressing the equation. So they make a lot less carbon emissions than places like those on the bottom. And it's just math. And the connection here is that these are the kinds of places that our land use decisions make. We made the places on the bottom. It took a lot of work. It took a ton of work to make places like those on the bottom. Incredibly detailed codes of hundreds, or even when you factor in additional manuals and guides and all sorts of stuff, probably thousands of pages to get an outcome that looked exactly like that. And that from a carbon perspective is the worst possible outcome you could possibly have. Now, again, someone might say, well, I don't care about carbon emissions or climate change. I like that kind of place. Yeah, that's fine. That's a valid perspective. But again, I think in cities like Raleigh and Asheville and a lot of other places too, actually, whether or not it's a big city or not, I think this is something people care about. If you want to minimize climate change and carbon emissions, then you can't continue to create places that look like that. So a lot of cities I've observed, and Raleigh was no different, we actually had some pretty good policies that talked about climate change for years, actually, in our comprehensive plan, decades even. We've had some policies that say, we should reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It was a pretty good policy. I agree with it. We should do that. And then a couple of years ago, and this was actually more meaningful, a little bit more specific, a goal of reducing emissions by 80% by 2050. And again, that was helpful. And that really did pair with what we did to start to make some changes in how we approach this. But a policy alone is definitely insufficient. It's not even close, because often it is not followed up with any kind of implementation plan, or, and I've observed this pretty frequently as well, the implementation plan is really only nibbling away at the margins. It might be, let's switch our city fleet over to a hybrid or electric vehicle fleet, which is great. That is what we should be doing. There's no question. But from a city's perspective, again, I found that perplexing, because it's doing something the city had the power to do, but not using this giant lever right over there, which is in some ways the main thing that the city does. Other than providing services to its citizens, it's making land use decisions. And it completely ignored that other lever that is the one that by 1,000-fold would be more impactful than whatever we do with our city vehicle fleet. And so again, that led to the frustration that led us to want to take a closer look at how we talk about land use decisions. And it really boils down, again, to the fact that we don't make that connection. And what our processes do fundamentally is to allow people to wish away the trade-offs embedded in every decision. People like magic. I like magic. It's a way of making things happen that can't happen. It's fun when it's a game or an illusion. In reality, though, magical thinking means we don't solve problems. And that example of allowing someone to build an apartment, let's say a 5-story typical kind of apartment that you see built now, when people say, well, I don't want that to be built there, and we don't talk about climate change, or for that matter, community health, or some other related issues, which are also a part of this. There's this idea, this magical thinking kind of idea that the people who would have lived in that apartment building just vanish. Well, that's ludicrous. In a city like Asheville, in a city like Charlotte, a city like Raleigh, people are moving to these cities. They are not going to not move to Raleigh or the metro area because that apartment isn't built. What they're going to do is they're going to move to Nightdale or Wake Forest, to use a couple of Raleigh suburbs, or pick your Asheville suburb. That's where they end up. And that means that they're going to drive, instead of not driving much or driving short distances or walking or using transit, they're going to drive a lot everywhere, every day, period. So it boils down to, if we don't allow people to live and work in these walkable places near transit, then they must, by definition, live and work in places that are not walkable and are not served by transit. That's the message kind of boiled down into one paragraph. And then the rest of what we did is figuring out how to actually talk about that and implement that and embed it in how we make decisions. So one of the ways we do it, when we do a planning process, any kind of area planning process, anything that starts to look at these decisions, we talk through very explicitly the trade-offs. I guess this is a bad thing to do. We take away the magic. So maybe that's a planner's job, is to take away the magic, but really that's actually the core of what we do. We have to make sure that people are focused on the implications, the long-term, the comprehensive implications of the decisions. So for instance, in Wake County, we have just past Mecklenburg, have more than 1 million people, projected to add several 100,000 more people over the coming decades. Similar with Raleigh, there's only two, it's a pretty binary choice here. We can, as Raleigh has in the past, more than Asheville, we could grow more around driving and you get what you see on the right, or you can grow more around transit, get what you see on the left, with all the related carbon emissions impacts that has. And so, we walk through it in a really specific way. And there's, people have feelings about this stuff, obviously, and it means acknowledging those. It means, so growing around driving, that means less change in places that are walkable, downtown, transit served. It means more change in places that are on the edges of the city. It means more driving per person. It's a iron law, it's reality. And it means higher carbon, and we highlight this. And other air pollution emissions, that's also something that we talk about a lot. And it means walking, to that community health angle, it's going to be more recreational, because you can't walk anywhere for a purpose. You can walk around your neighborhood and it might be nice, but it's not going to be part of your daily life. Growing more around walkable places, it does mean more change. And that can get pretty complex in places where you have very real concerns about affordability and displacement. That's a complex conversation. In other places, those are not so much pressing concerns, and it's more, everyone I think has heard concerns about character or the other things that constantly are discussed in those conversations. But in either case, acknowledging that it does mean more change, but it means less driving per person. We know this. It means less carbon emissions, less air pollution. We know this. It allows more walkable lifestyles. We know this. It creates more housing options, and so on and on and on and on. And so what we did in a really specific way for a recent planning effort that thought about how should we grow as we add new jobs and residents in the future? Where does it make the most sense? And we decided to get really specific with it and say, well, let's call the question. Let's force the hand, so to speak. So we had people come in and we gave them 100 Lego blocks, literally. Each group got a set of blocks, and they got a map, a highly generalized map that showed downtown, that showed the location of our future bus rapid transit projects, and said, okay, go. You've got to put the blocks somewhere, because people are coming to Raleigh. You don't have a magic wand. That wasn't part of the game. You've got to put them somewhere. And when you've force the decision like that. And that always has been the decision. We just didn't acknowledge it very clearly. It's always the decision because it's easy to ignore change when it's happening 20 miles away from you. And in fact, it does get wished away. But we did not allow that to happen. You had to put them somewhere. And so I didn't know exactly what would happen when we went through this exercise, to be honest. I had an idea, but I was as interested as anybody else to see what would happen. So we had a bunch of great conversations all in one big room, put people in groups. And this looks almost like a setup as if this was just one that we chose, but every single group, their map looked almost exactly like this, where they actually put more blocks downtown and near transit and other walkable places than I thought they would. They basically put all the chips down there, which is probably not exactly obviously how it's going to play out in reality. But what it showed is when you frame the question that way, a lot of people really started to say, well, okay, people are going to be somewhere. It makes sense to let them live and work in places where the carbon impact is the least, the community health benefit is the highest, and so on. And it was a real consensus that emerged from that. And it cemented for me that this was something, not just the right thing to do. And I'll paraphrase, there was a statesman who, in support of, I don't remember what the argument was in particular, but he said it has the added advantage of being true, which is obviously a pretty cynical take. Well, I'd say in this case, this kind of analysis is the right thing to do. And it has the added advantage of actually being really popular, at least in places like Raleigh and I'm sure Asheville and other similar cities. So here's another example of where we use this in an area planning process in a slightly different way. So in this case, we were at close to the end of the process. This is, for those of you who know Raleigh, it's an area called Midtown, which is on our belt line. And it's starting to see some pretty large scale development and redevelopment. So a lot of planning work about how to address transportation needs. And by framing the questions to a high degree around, not just how do people get around by driving, but how do you want to get around? What would be the way you would prefer to get around? And when we have to make trade-offs between getting around on foot and getting around in car, what's more important? Because there are trade-offs. A complete street is great, but inevitably there's going to be some decisions that favor one mode or another. And so people went pretty heavily down the road of walkability there. And then what we did at the end of the process, where we had a bunch of projects that came out of this that were identified, almost all, no road widening, some additional street connections to create a grid where it didn't exist, and a lot of pedestrian first projects. And so we put them all in front of people and said, let's figure out which ones are the top priorities. And so we talked in a very generalized way about the benefits, and you can see some of these little icons. So this one would be a new bridge just for people walking or biking over the 440 belt line. And so we talked about pros and cons and costs, and very explicitly noted as an advantage carbon reduction. So people were getting around here in a non-motorized way. And again, that was something that really resonated with people, and it helped them see that there are ways that on a local level, we can address this. I guess I've said it a couple of times, but I cannot overstate how much people want to be a part of the solution. That is the thing that is by far my biggest takeaway here. So it's really just giving them the opportunity to do what they already want to do, which is to do some work on this. So this is getting really into the nuts and bolts, but I think it's really important. So this is a section from our staff report that I talked about that we do. I'm sure Asheville, every city does some kind of staff analysis with respect to a rezoning or an area plan or similar kind of policy changes. So we did, and I think I touched on this before, we did this super detailed assessment of future utility demand, which is worth knowing. But what bothered me though is we did all this super detailed work and didn't anywhere at all talk about carbon or climate change in there. So this is where we started to think about, well, how do we actually do it? It's one thing to say, let's reduce carbon, but it's another thing to actually make some connections to these decisions in a way that people are going to find convincing and plausible. Because if you don't do that, if you're kind of just asserting, that doesn't feel like quite enough. That feels like that was the old approach of just having a policy that sat there and not really implementing it in a meaningful way. So we wanted to account for emissions in these rezoning and area planning processes where we talk about how we should grow. So it was not, I had thought that we would just look around, find a community that was doing this, copy it, and call it a day. And that did not turn out to be how it played out. We weren't able to find a really good example. And I have no doubt that there's some communities that do have some good examples, but we did not find them. So we moved on to step 2, which is looking at a really detailed model. So we talked with our MPO about, can you give us something where we can plug in an address and it will generate on average vehicle miles per household per day or per year, some metric like that. So we could see, and I mean, I think that would be obvious what the implications would be. Somewhere far out on the fringes, people drive a lot. Somewhere close, not so much. And would also be more likely to get around on transit or walking. But they did not quite have that fine-grained a tool, excuse me, all, that we were able to use for this. So, and just a second. Thank you. So after looking through that, and I actually do still think there's some promise to develop a tool like that. But we opted for an approach that was something that we could just go ahead and implement and was simpler. And that I actually think, I didn't really realize at the time, had some other benefits in terms of legibility. So what we ended up doing is just taking the walk score. I think everybody's probably familiar with that. Real estate listings now routinely include that as something that anybody can go out and look at for any site. And that's one of the big benefits, is instead of creating kind of a complicated model that might be a black box. And I guess to some extent, some people might say that the walk score is a little bit of a black box, but I think anybody who spent any amount of time on it recognizes that it very accurately reflects how walkable or transit served, with some exceptions, obviously, but generally reflects a pretty walkable place or a pretty unwalkable place. So what we did was ultra simple. We looked at the city average for a transit score and a walk score, which is pretty low. It's 30. I actually don't know what it is in Asheville. It has to be higher than that. Asheville, I would guess, probably has the highest in the state as an average, but I don't know that. And then we looked at, well, is what's being proposed higher or lower or similar or whatever. So if it's higher, as generally a lot of these bigger changes are, and generally people are not necessarily clamoring to put a 5-story apartment or mixed-use building, right in the middle of a place where there's low density and not a lot of adjacent walkability of transit. It's usually, these are the kind of places where it happens. And so if it's higher, then pretty obviously people who are going to be living there are going to have a lower transportation footprint than the city's average, because they're going to have shorter trips in cars. They're going to have more trips that aren't in cars, and overall are going to produce less carbon. And so we summarize that in our staff report. And I'll talk about a little bit more about how we communicate this, because this is pretty detailed. I don't know how many people read down to every page of these staff reports, but this is something that we knew we had to have. So that's the transportation slice of that pie that we showed a little bit back. But the other really big slice of that pie, and this is the one I think is less immediately obvious until you talk through it for a second for a lot of people, but it's incredibly impactful. And actually, I think in comparing the United States to those other countries, I think this may be just as important as the transportation differences. And it has to do with the inherent energy efficiency of different housing types. A detached house has the outside on in every direction except for the ground. It doesn't share any walls with another housing unit. It is therefore, and these statistics, by the way, coming from the Department of Energy, so we didn't make these up. It's inherently less, by a lot, energy efficient and produces more carbon. And that's compared to, and this is how they break it down, to a townhouse. So there you're starting to share some walls and starts to be more energy efficient. Also reflects the size of the buildings as well and how much space has to be heated. Smaller apartment, so maybe a triplex or quad, if it's stacked on top, you're starting to share a ceiling as well. And then a larger apartment, you've got more shared walls. And so it is by far the most energy efficient and least carbon emitting housing type. So to say that we won't allow people to build these is to say we want to produce more carbon emissions. Well, that is not what most people want. But again, highlighting this, making that trade-off, it changes the conversation so much. It's more than I would have thought possible. So that's pretty fine-grained detail, right? And I am under no illusions that a lot of people are going to page 32 or whatever of our staff report. Some people are, but most people aren't pouring through that. But even necessarily all the decision makers themselves. But what we do is when we present this, we present to the Planning Commission, to the City Council. We highlight these. Every single Planning Commission meeting, I am talking about the same things that I'm talking about with y'all now. So it starts to really sink in the minds of Planning Commissioners and City Council. It starts to sink in the minds of people who are showing up frequently or who are showing up once to comment. Probably some people are showing up and hearing this, and even maybe as they start to comment, I think that's something that they're starting to think about, because we talk about it a lot. And when we finally, as staff, say, here is how something is or isn't consistent with our comprehensive plan, we highlight this. And for whatever reason, we did not do this until just the last couple of years, but you see these different policies that, so this would be for, again, allowing more housing near a walkable place or near some transit, some policies that support providing more housing supply. This one in particular, I think it would be some senior housing. That's where you see the aging in place. But you see that EP 1.1 greenhouse gas reduction. We didn't used to cite that. We had this great policy sitting there in a comprehensive plan and we didn't use it. And so now we do, and now we have all the supporting analysis to back that up. And again, sometimes I feel like I sound almost like a broken record, but I think that constant repeating of this message, I have seen it sink in. And the way I think that you really know when it does is when you hear someone you don't even know say something back and you hear it that you knew came from something that we had put together in the first place. So it starts to be absorbed and people really do listen. If you can provide information that's backed up logically, that has some thought behind it. You know, I know we all feel like we're in an age of information overload and kind of echo chambers, but you do break through that if you have a well thought through way of delivering some analysis. So, you know, again, we go through this really frequently. I think it's broadened the understanding of this link. We would like to explore in more detail. Could we get a more detailed model? But I actually think there's some advantages to the simplicity here. So to me, it would have, and it's also easy to implement. It takes no time. It's not some complicated thing where we have to run like a transportation model to make it work. It just, it takes just a few minutes. I think the simplicity is probably a net benefit in this case. So last slide I have, takeaways. Asheville, I'm sure, has some great policies in its comprehensive plan, or Buncombe County or Marshall. Some of the communities there have some policies about this, but it's not enough. You got to have a way to embed it into decision makings and in a very public way. So you're talking about this. And here's the thing. If planners don't do this, whether that's nonprofit side, anybody in this planning space, but anybody who's in that role of a planner, and I don't mean just a city staff planner, but if people who are thinking long-term and comprehensively don't do this, no one else will. You'll only hear the more narrow perspectives that you usually hear. And then again, the last one, I would underline, people like this. They really, really like this. It has been a much more popular concept than I thought. And it's something that I would strongly urge every community to, and there's different paths for how to do it. There may be a better way to do it than we're doing. But in whatever way makes the most sense for your community, make sure that this is a part of the conversation. So that's all I have. I'm going to stop sharing, and it looks like there's some questions in the chat. I really look forward to hearing your questions.
Thanks so much, Jason. That was really interesting. Just as a little bit of background for attendees, we saw that Raleigh had a 30 score walk score and a 30 transit score. Asheville has a 34 average walk score, and our transit score is 26. So it tells you a little bit about what we might be doing a little bit better and what we might not be doing such a good job at. When compared to Raleigh. But just for the listeners' benefit, could you just provide a really quick snippet of how walk score, transit score is computed?
Yeah, so and first, for those who don't know, so it's a private entity. And one of the things that we thought about is, should we rely on that? But started to realize that it's become so ubiquitous that people are familiar with it, I think trust it. And I've seen some other communities not use it in this particular way, but cite it and refer to it, just because I think it has become almost a brand name of how you calculate this. So, and there is a little bit of a black box element to how they do it, but it basically looks at proximity of origin, and this is a little transportation planners, but origin and destination. So is my house, let's say, how close is it to a grocery store? How close is it to a school, a park, an office, a workplace, and so on? And then what is the transportation network? Is it a bunch of loops and lollipops, so that even if I'm physically close to the destination, it would take me, and I saw an example from Orlando of two houses that shared a back fence, but to get from one to the other without jumping the fence literally was something like 10 miles of going roundabout in this insane way. So it looks at the actual street connectivity and infrastructure there. So it's based on an analysis of land use and transportation that, from everything I've been able to see, is pretty accurate. And then transit, that's the one I would note, a little asterisk. The transit score does not always necessarily, and maybe this is kind of a Raleigh thing, because we've added a lot of transit service lately. We've created a sales tax just for transit that's increased our transit frequency. And we're adding a lot of bus rapid transit. I touched on that. And so sometimes I notice it's a little bit slow to keep up with that. So if we notice that the transit score doesn't reflect some recent service, we'll add that. And I guess that is one more little caveat, is we have some space. It is a little bit of a crude metric compared to a more detailed model. It has the virtue of simplicity, but sometimes it's a little crude. So we'll add some additional context and nuance where it looks like that's something that's important to do.
What has been your experience with NCDOT, with the Department of Transportation? Have they been receptive to this?
We haven't had a lot of conversations with them about this. They have a different mission for the most part. I think that in recent years, they've started to care more about the, I guess, from their perspective, secondary impacts of their decisions. From, I think, a city's perspective, the primary impacts. But no, I would not anticipate that it's something that they would particularly focus on.
The question regarding the Lego block exercise, which I thought was really interesting. Buncombe County is in the midst of its own comprehensive planning process, as is Henderson County. And to me, that's such a useful exercise for really grappling with the issues that are presented. The question that we had regarding that exercise was how was it advertised in order to attract an audience? And did you find was that audience one that was already receptive to more growth in their particular community, or were they comfortable putting that growth in other areas outside of their community?
That's a really good question. And that can make a big difference. So the first part was, how do we market it? So that was focusing on planning around the bus rapid transit network. So there's 4 BRT corridors that we've identified. One will start construction next year. So these are well underway. They radiate out from downtown in each direction. And so what we did before we started to get more fine-grained into changing the zoning around those corridors, we want to do more of a big picture, kind of a comprehensive plan around transit process. So we did mailings, some what I thought were pretty extensive. It was maybe 15 or 20,000 letters, plus all the other ways that we try to get out information. I think we drew a pretty diverse group, demographically, but also I think the question was more diverse in terms of people who might have different takes. So like not just the advocates for transit, there were some for sure, but I think we had a different group. Now, the one thing that was different, I think the part of the question was, how are people thinking about that in terms of their own community? So it's pretty broad based. Those corridors, it extends several miles. So there was probably the space for people to not worry too much, for those who would be worried about more change in their own community. But I don't actually think that that was something that they were necessarily, that was at the top of their mind anyway. I think people, we wanted them to think through, well, it would be more change for my community, but I see the benefits of that. So I think people actually did wrestle with that. We knew that we had people, let me answer it this way. We didn't have people who were obviously trying to put it somewhere else. I would say that. It probably did help, but it was kind of a broader and more conceptual process than just a zoning process. And that just by its nature, the smaller the geographical focus, the more people feel it and have pretty strong feelings, care loudly about it sometimes. And so actually since then, I didn't touch on that, but we have started to, for the city on its own initiative, to change the zoning along these corridors. We've started that process now on 3 of them, to the point where we've actually literally, we're about to get to the stage where we're at the planning commission. So we've had initial neighborhood meetings, and that process is going pretty smoothly so far. And I think it's in part because we paved the way through the previous planning process. And I think it's in part because we continually talk about the same kind of things that I talked about. And I think that just frames the conversation so differently than the way it was in the past, that it makes for a much, much different and frankly, better conversation.
We have a question acknowledging that the increased levels of density are necessary, and better transit and walkability are good things. However, it works much better when that is coupled with green space and green infrastructure also being valued and planned for. The question is, why does green space planning usually not get the adequate level of attention? Or maybe to turn that question around, does your model account for green infrastructure when looking at the carbon analysis of particular developments and policies?
It doesn't explicitly, and I think that would be interesting to think about. We do, on a citywide basis, we've done a lot in recent years to require green infrastructure as a part of projects. And one thing I think is helpful in general is when you want to make a change like that, have it be citywide and not try to focus it on a specific area or project, but just require, if it's good, require it across the board. I think I get an element of the question. I've heard it a couple of times, which is, and I'm not sure if this is what this question was getting at, but if you have a loss of, let's say, tree canopy as some areas are developed more intensely, does the model factor that in? It doesn't explicitly, but I don't really see a way that even if and it does in some cases, and we actually have relaxed rules for tree conservation near transit, because allowing more people to live there in a more dense and walkable way, whatever the loss in terms of tree canopy, which is important, and thinking about urban heat island effects, that is important. But that is definitely outweighed by not having the massive sprawl and auto-centric development. But no, it doesn't incorporate that metric specifically.
Thanks. So in Asheville, and I'm sure this is the case just about everywhere, we get a lot of pushback on new development, even along transit corridors. And one of the arguments that we hear from folks pushing back is that new construction is inherently worse for carbon dioxide than reuse. How have you all weighed this tension?
There's no question that there's embedded carbon in existing structures, and that new construction, there's no question it takes it. But again, it goes back to that question of thinking about what happens if you don't do it. So if there is going to be new construction, there just is, because people are moving to Raleigh. And if we've got, say, an existing detached house, then that's not that uncommon to have that. And the proposal is, a multi-story apartment building. So yeah, there's new construction and there's embedded carbon in the house. But again, it doesn't mean there won't be new construction. It just means we get more detached houses in Nightdale instead of one apartment building in Raleigh. It just boils down to that.
Recently, we Asheville rezoned more than 200 acres to promote higher density and mixed use infill. And however, we get a lot of pushback from the development community that claims that this theory can't really be applied to a suburban small town in the mountains. Any thoughts on that?
I think small towns in this country often have the best bones for walkability, because a lot of them haven't been destroyed, or large swaths of them been destroyed by the car-centric planning of the last 50 years. It, to me, is one of the very best places where it is very easy to walk everywhere. You have an intact street grid, kind of like some of you probably have noticed the one behind me. That was basically downtown Raleigh of 100 years ago. We since then blew up portions of that street grid, and then everywhere out of that old grid, you don't have a grid anymore. And so by definition, you're driving. That's one of the best things about a small town, is it does have the bones for that. So I definitely disagree pretty strongly that that's not a good place to allow more people to live. Thanks.
That's interesting. Does Raleigh have an effective public transportation system? I know here it's debatable whether we do, and a lot of people tend not to use public transportation simply because of the frequency of buses. What is Raleigh's situation like?
Well, I didn't know it until we got into this call, but from Chris, the statistic you just threw out, it sounds like Raleigh beats Asheville by 4 points, I think. Yeah. So I think we're both obviously in the very awkward growing phase of maturing into a real transit system. Raleigh has done a lot. And we had a great planning process to talk about this, that in some ways talked through some similar trade-offs about how to invest in transit. And so that led to the bus rapid transit work that is now being implemented. And then in a much less glamorous way, taking a lot of our higher ridership routes and converting them into high frequency routes, which we define as 15 minutes or less. So you don't have to worry about the timeline. So I think we're right on that edge of going from a city with just the absolute basic bare bones level of transit that is just misery for transit riders, where you have hour-long or more trips if you have to make a connection to something that is almost like a real city transit system, where it's very possible for people, at least in a lot of the city, to rely on that, to shift down to maybe a car light household or even a car free household. we're there in some areas, and in the areas where that's possible are growing more every month.
All right, so I think we have time for one more question, and it just came in, so we'll close on this, and I'll read it in its entirety. Our city's sustainability council is concerned about the lack of tree canopy in marginalized communities that are also high density neighborhoods. While the city has over 13 fully electric city buses and the routes are inefficient, how can the importance of building policy on carbon emissions be baked into plans so that low wealth communities can benefit immediately?
Well, that's great. And I think an aggressive tree planting program is essential. And I think it's not the case that there's these existing like forest in those neighborhoods. I think the real issue is there's not a lot of street trees because either when the neighborhoods were built, it wasn't required, or there just wasn't a desire. It was just one of many forms of disinvestment in lower income or minority communities along the years to not have some street trees. So anything that we can do to incentivize that, I think is good. Anytime you have new development in communities like that, there are a lot of issues to work through. We incentivize affordability, affordable housing units, and have recently passed an affordable housing bond to directly subsidize affordable housing units. But also so development has its challenges, but when it happens, that does mean you get some new street trees, you start to build that canopy, and having a city program or nonprofit funded program to provide those trees and help them get them planted is also essential.
Well, we have made it to 1 o'clock. Jason, I want to thank you so much for sharing the tool that you all have developed and the perspective that you've brought along with it. I think it's really incredible, and one that I think could be really helpful here in Nashville as we grapple with a number of development decisions. I think it's also really interesting to see how that can be exported to some of the smaller towns in Western North Carolina as well. So I will close things off by just first of all thanking Jason again for taking the time to share all his knowledge with us. I want to thank all the participants for carving out some time in your day to join us. That does it for our 2021 Building Our City Speaker Series. We appreciate y'all and your support, and we will follow up with an email that will provide a link to the video for today's presentation. So if you want to catch it again, I know there were a couple questions that came up regarding specifics in the presentation. I'll follow up with you, Jason, to get answers and then follow up with the participants. And lastly, I hope everyone has a peaceful, relaxing holiday break, and we look forward to connecting with everyone in the new year. So with that, thanks again, and everyone be well.